The plow struck something that was not stone, not root, and not the bones of the earth that had swallowed Elias Craw's last 3 harvests whole. It struck something that rang, a deep, resonant tone that traveled up the wooden handle, through his cracked palms, and straight into the hollow place behind his ribs where hope had not lived for a very long time. Elias stopped. He stood in the brutal Kansas sun of 1874, sweat soaking through the back of his faded gray shirt, and looked down at the furrow he'd torn open in the dry, crumbling soil of a farm that no longer belonged to him in any way that mattered. The bank's paper said they owned it. The bank's paper said he had 47 days. But in that moment, with his knees dropping to the scorched earth and his fingers clawing at the dry clods, the world contracted to a single point of impossible, terrifying light. Gold. Not a nugget, not a coin, a vessel, wide as a wagon wheel's hub, hammered smooth, decorated with symbols that no man he'd ever known could read. And beneath it, as he dug with his bare hands like a man possessed, more, much more. Elias Craw was 51 years old, lean to the point of gauntness, with iron-gray hair cropped close to a head that had known too many seasons of open sky and too few of shade. His eyes were the color of winter ice over shallow water, pale blue, flat, observant, set beneath brows that had grown thick and expressive with age, the only theatrical thing about a man who had otherwise scoured himself down to pure function over the decades. His hands were a working man's hands, the knuckles enlarged, the skin a permanent dark tan from wrist to fingertip, the kind of hands that told a man's whole biography without a word being spoken. He stood an inch over 6 feet, though he carried himself slightly hunched now, the way men do when life has pressed down on them long enough that the spine begins to remember the pressure even when it's gone. His jaw was square and clean-shaved that morning, though by afternoon a gray shadow was already returning. He wore canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, suspenders, and a wide-brimmed straw hat that had gone brown and misshapen long before this particular summer. He was not a man given to emotion. He was not a man given to prayer, having stopped that business after his wife Margaret passed in the winter of '71, and the Lord saw fit to take the 2 eldest children the following spring with fever. He was a man who rose before the sun and lay down after it and measured his existence in bushels and acres and the grinding arithmetic of debt. But kneeling in that furrow on the 23rd of July, in the year of our Lord 1874, Elias Craw pressed his forehead against the cold surface of a 1,000-year-old Sioux ceremonial gold vessel and wept without sound or shame for the first time in 3 years. He did not know in that moment what the gold was. He did not know what it meant, or where it had come from, or what spirits, Lakota, or older still, had placed it in the earth beneath this particular piece of Kansas dust. He did not know that 3 men, at that precise hour, were riding toward his farm from 3 different directions, each for a different reason, each arriving at the same terrible conclusion through different roads. He did not know that by morning, everything would be irreversible. He only knew that he had found something extraordinary in the dirt of his ruined life. And he knew, with the animal certainty of a man who had survived long enough to recognize the smell of danger, that he should tell absolutely no one. He was too late for that already. Elias had one hand he trusted in this world, and that was his youngest son, Thomas, called Tom by everyone but his father, who had strong opinions about names and the dignity they carried. Tom was 22, built wider than his father and 2 inches shorter, with the same pale eyes, but a jaw that was still unfinished looking, still carrying the remnants of youth even as his shoulders had broadened into something genuinely formidable. He had his mother's dark hair, worn longer than was fashionable, curling at the collar of his work shirt, and a way of going still when he was thinking that made him look, in certain lights, like a man considerably older than his years. He wore a battered brown hat, its crown dimpled from years of handling, and a vest the color of old rust over his blue work shirt. A vest with 2 pockets in which he kept, respectively, a folding knife and a small photograph of his mother, taken before the consumption took her. He carried no sidearm openly in the field, but there was a Winchester rifle leaned against the fence post at the edge of the south field, as there had been every working day since the trouble with the Cutter brothers 2 springs past. Tom was mending that south fence when his father appeared at the edge of the cornfield, moving wrong. Not injured, Elias moved too deliberately for injury, but tight, contained, the way he moved when something large was happening inside him, and he was holding it down by main force of will. Tom set down the fence wire and waited. "Come," was all Elias said. They stood together in the furrow as the afternoon light turned from white to amber, and Elias showed his son what the earth had given up. Tom crouched down and looked at the pieces they had uncovered. 7 vessels of varying sizes, each one hammered from what was unmistakably gold, each one covered in the spiral and geometric patterns that Tom recognized, vaguely, from the stories the old Lakota trapper Stands in Water used to tell when he came through the territory in the years before the wars had pushed the last of the free bands north and west. The symbols were not decoration. Tom understood that much without being told. These were objects of meaning, objects of ceremony, objects that belonged to a people and a story that predated every fence post and furrow and deed of title on this entire Kansas plain by 1,000 years or more. "How much?" Tom asked, because he was his father's son, and the arithmetic arrived before anything else. "Enough," Elias said. "Enough to clear the bank. Enough to buy seed and equipment and have money left. Enough to make this farm into something again." Tom looked up at his father. "That ain't really the question I meant." Elias met his son's eyes. They understood each other, these two, more through silence than through speech, more through work done side by side than through any conversation either of them was capable of having. What Tom meant was, enough to bring trouble. Enough to bring the kind of men who followed the smell of gold the way wolves followed the smell of blood, patient and inevitable and without mercy. "We cover it back up," Elias said. "Tonight we go to Harlan, to the bank. We settle the debt. We do it quiet." "You think Dunn will be quiet about it?" Elias said nothing. Cornelius Dunn was the president of the Harlan Territorial Bank and Trust, a man of approximately 50 pounds excess weight, a gold watch chain that he touched constantly as though reassuring himself of its existence, and a moral character that could be summarized accurately in 3 words: entirely for sale. Elias had been dealing with Dunn for 6 years. He knew the man the way you know a drought, not with any particular hatred, but with a clear and unsentimental understanding of what it was capable of. "We don't have a choice," Elias said. "We need his receipt. We need the deed back in our name. That's the only protection we've got." Tom stood up from his crouch and looked out at the horizon in the direction of Harlan, 14 miles to the northeast. The sky was beginning its evening performance, broad orange and violet streaks, the kind of sky that looked painted, that looked like something a man had made up to comfort himself, beautiful and meaningless. "I'll hitch the wagon," Tom said. "If you're finding this story as gripping as we do, the kind of tale that makes the Old West live and breathe again, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss another one." Now back to Elias and Tom and the gold that was already changing everything. They drove to Harlan in the falling dark, with the gold wrapped in burlap sacking in the wagon bed, covered over with a tarpaulin, and then with 2 bales of old straw. Elias drove. Tom sat beside him with the Winchester across his knees, watching the road and the scrub on either side of it with the particular quality of attention that didn't look like attention, relaxed, unfocused, taking in everything. The horse, a 16-year-old roan mare named Judith, who had outlasted everything else on the Craw farm, moved at her steady, unhurried walk, and the wagon wheels ground in the dust, and neither man spoke for the first 4 miles. It was Tom who broke the silence eventually. "You know what those symbols are." "I know what they might be." Stands in Water said there were ceremonial caches from before the Lakota moved north. Old ones. Mandan maybe, or older. He said the earth keeps them. The earth kept these well enough. He said they weren't for taking. Elias was quiet for a moment. The mare's ears twitched at something in the darkness to the left. A coyote, probably, or a jackrabbit, and she adjusted her path by half an inch and then corrected back. Elias led her. "I reckon," he said finally, "that the earth doesn't much care what we do with them now. The earth's had its 1,000 years." Tom said nothing to that. He wasn't sure he agreed, but he had learned early that there were arguments with his father that consumed energy without changing minds, and this felt like one of them. The night insects were loud around them. A half moon had come up, giving just enough silver light to see the road. They were alone on it, which was what they'd hoped for. They were not, in fact, alone. But they wouldn't know that until Harlan. Cornelius Dunn did not receive visitors at 10 o'clock at night with any particular grace. He came to the door of his substantial house on Elm Street, the only house in Harlan with a second story and a proper porch with railings, in his robe and nightcap, holding a lamp and wearing an expression that cycled rapidly from irritation to curiosity to something more calculating, as Elias Cross stood on his porch and told him, in the flattest possible voice, that he wished to settle his debt that evening and would require his receipt and the deed returned. "It is 10 o'clock at night, Elias." "It is. I apologize for the hour, Cornelius. I have the funds." Dunn's eyes went to the wagon in the street, where Tom sat on the seat with the Winchester visible across his lap, then back to Elias. "What funds?" Dunn said. "You haven't had funds in 3 years." "I have them now." The calculation behind Dunn's small, sharp eyes was almost audible. A man doing arithmetic in his head with the speed of long practice, balancing possibilities against risks, profit against exposure, greed against the various inconveniences of legal and social consequence. He was not a stupid man. He had simply organized his intelligence entirely in the service of acquisition, which made him, in Elias's experience, more dangerous than men who were clever and cruel in more straightforward ways. "You'd better come in," Dunn said. The transaction took 40 minutes. Dunn examined the gold with the careful, reverent attention of a man who had spent his life in the proximity of money and knew what it looked like in all its forms. He said nothing about what he thought it was or where it had come from. He produced his scale. He calculated. He produced the deed to the Craw farm and the promissory notes, stacked them on his desk with the precision of a man who took comfort in the orderliness of paper. And when Elias pushed the first vessel across the desk and said that was payment in full for the debt and the interest and the late penalties, Dunn put the vessel on his scale and wrote in his ledger and stamped the receipt with his bank stamp and handed everything to Elias without looking him in the eye. Elias had paid 1 vessel. He had 6 more in the wagon. Dunn knew that. Elias knew that Dunn knew that. And as Elias folded the deed and the receipt into his coat pocket and stood to leave, the two men regarded each other with the complete mutual comprehension of men who understand precisely how the other will behave and can do nothing about it. "Good evening, Cornelius," Elias said. "Good evening, Elias," Dunn said. Tom drove them out of Harlan at a trot, pushing Judith harder than was fair to the old mare, and they were a mile north of town before either of them spoke. "He'll talk by morning," Tom said. "Before morning," Elias said. The rider who had followed them from Harlan was named Cole Rafter, and he was employed, loosely, by Cornelius Dunn. Not on any paper that existed, but in the way that certain men in certain towns are employed by powerful men, performing the services that power requires, but that the powerful cannot be seen to require. Cole Rafter was 34 years old and had the kind of face that was simultaneously forgettable and, once you had reason to look at it carefully, deeply unpleasant. Not in its features, which were ordinary enough, but in the quality of absence behind the eyes, as though the usual human content had been removed and replaced with something simpler and more functional. He was medium height, lean, wore a dark coat over a black shirt and dark trousers, rode a black horse, and carried 2 revolvers on a cross-draw rig that he had clearly worn long enough to move with. He did not hurry. He did not need to. He knew where the Craw farm was. He had been there before, twice, delivering Dunn's past due notices with the combination of politeness and unmistakable menace that was his professional specialty. He hung back far enough that they wouldn't hear his horse, and he watched the farm with the patience of a man who had done this kind of work many times and understood that haste was the enemy of outcome. He watched Elias and Tom unload the wagon in the dark, with the help of a single lantern. He watched them carry things into the barn. He made no move. He was not alone in watching. In the cottonwood break to the east of the farm, 2 other men sat their horses in the dark and watched the same activity. These were the Pruitt brothers, older brother Warren, younger brother Deke, and they had come to the Craw farm through an entirely different chain of circumstance. Warren Pruitt was 40, built thick and wide, with a broad, flat face under a cattleman's hat, and hands that were almost comically large, the hands of a man built for a scale larger than human. Deke was 36, leaner, with quick eyes and the restless energy of a man who was always calculating distances. They had been in Harlan earlier that day, in the saloon, when a teamster who had been out toward the Craw farm on a lumber delivery had mentioned, over his 3rd whiskey, that old Elias Craw's plow had come up ringing against something in the south field, and that Elias had gone white as new linen and called his boy over, and the 2 of them had spent 20 minutes crouched in the furrow before covering it back up and heading for the barn. It wasn't much, but Warren Pruitt had spent 15 years following the smell of gold through territories where gold had no business being, and he had developed the same sensitivity to these particular signals that a hunting dog develops to the smell of specific prey. He had come out of the saloon, saddled up, collected his brother, and ridden the 14 miles to the Craw farm with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows the quarry isn't going anywhere. He hadn't expected Cole Rafter. He hadn't expected that Rafter was already here. The 2 groups of men became aware of each other at roughly the same moment, in the way that predators in the same territory become aware of each other. Not through direct observation, but through the displacement of small sounds, the slight change in the quality of darkness, the horse that shifted and snorted at an unfamiliar scent. "Company," Deke murmured. "I see it," Warren said. Neither of them moved. Neither did Rafter, in the shadows near the road. In the farmhouse, a lamp came on, then a second one. Elias and Tom, having returned from Harlan and dealt with the gold, were moving through the ordinary motions of the night, bolting doors, securing shutters, the domestic rituals of men who had grown up on the frontier and understood that darkness was not neutral. They had done these things by habit before they knew they were needed. Now something in the air, some change in the texture of the night's silence, made both of them stop and stand still in separate rooms of the small house and listen. Tom moved to the window and looked out at the barn. Nothing. Looked at the road. Nothing he could see. Moved to the back of the house and looked at the cottonwood break to the east. Nothing. But the absence of obvious threat was not the same as the absence of threat, and Tom had lived on this frontier long enough to know the difference. He found his father in the kitchen, already sitting at the table with the Winchester laid across it and both hands flat on the wood beside it. "We got visitors," Tom said. "How many?" "Can't tell yet. At least 2 positions, maybe more." Elias looked at his son. "The gold is in the cellar under the root vegetable bins. The deed and receipt are in my coat. I know. If something happens to me..." "Nothing's happening to you," Tom said, with the particular flat certainty of a young man who has decided something is not going to be permitted to occur and is prepared to enforce that decision. Elias almost smiled at that. Almost. "The receipt is what matters," he said. "The bank can't touch the farm. That's settled. Whatever else happens tonight, the farm is settled." What happened next happened in the way that violence in the Old West so often happened. Not in a clean, dramatic arc of challenge and response, but in a series of miscalculations, each small, each feeding the next, building to a consequence that no single person in the sequence had fully intended. Cole Rafter decided to move when the lights in the farmhouse went out at midnight. This was routine for him. Darkness as a resource, surprise as the primary instrument of negotiation. He did not know the Pruitt brothers were in the cottonwood break. He rode his black horse across the open ground toward the farmhouse in a long, quiet arc, dismounted at the fence, tied the horse, and came the last 50 yards on foot with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this many times. He had not accounted for the fact that Tom Craw was not in the farmhouse. Tom had gone out the back door 40 minutes before the lights went out, while his father deliberately moved from room to room to suggest occupation, and had circled wide around the south side of the farm and come in through the back of the barn, where he now sat on the old hay bales in the loft with the Winchester, watching the road. He saw Rafter come off his horse at the fence. He saw the dark coat, the cross-draw rig, the quality of movement that told him this was not a curious neighbor. He also saw at that moment the two men emerge from the cottonwood brake on horseback and begin moving toward the farmhouse from the east. 3 men, different approaches, none of them aware of the others. Tom made a decision that was, in the context of everything he knew and everything he valued, entirely rational, though a man with more experience might have found a more elegant solution. He stood up in the loft, threw open the barn door, and fired a single rifle shot into the air. The sound of a Winchester at night in flat Kansas country carries an extraordinary distance. What it does to men who are engaged in furtive activity at close range is even more extraordinary. Cole Rafter dropped flat to the ground behind the fence. Warren Pruitt's horse shied hard, and Deke's horse bolted 30 yards before Deke got control of it. From the farmhouse, a light reappeared. Elias, lamp in hand, at the front window with his own rifle in the other hand. "That is a Winchester rifle," Tom shouted from the barn loft, pitching his voice to carry to all 3 positions. "And there are 2 more inside this house. Whatever business you think you have here tonight, you are welcome to state it from where you stand, or you are welcome to ride away. Those are the choices." There was a silence of perhaps 10 seconds, the kind of silence that has texture and weight, in which multiple calculations are happening simultaneously in multiple minds. It was Warren Pruitt who spoke first. He had ridden back to the fence line where Rafter was still flat on the ground, and he looked at the dark shape in the barn loft with the rifle and said, with the particular weary candor of a man who had been in enough of these situations to know when the odds had turned, "Rafter, that you behind the fence?" Another silence. Then Rafter's voice, flat and irritated. "Warren Pruitt, I should have known. Small world. It ain't small enough for both of us to get paid on this. Reckon not." Tom watched this exchange from the loft with the Winchester still up, trying to understand the geometry of what he was hearing. They knew each other. They were both here for the same reason, and they were not apparently prepared to work together, which was, he ran the calculation quickly, in some ways better, and in some ways considerably worse than if they had been. "I got paper on this farm," Rafter said, standing up from behind the fence with his hands slightly away from his sides, the posture of a man being very careful about appearances. "Dunn sent me to discuss terms." "Dunn got his terms," Elias's voice came from the house. "He got paid in full tonight. Ask him." A pause. "Paid in full," Rafter said, and in the flat repetition there was something that might, in a different man, have been surprise. In Rafter it was recalibration. "Receipts in my coat," Elias said. "Deeds back in our name. Whatever Dunn told you, it's settled. You can verify that with him in the morning." Rafter stood at the fence for a long moment. His purpose had been, in the euphemistic language he and Dunn used for these arrangements, to discuss the situation with Elias Craw, and to leave with either a significant portion of whatever Elias had found, or with a clear and convincing understanding of where the rest was. Neither option was available to him now, in a farmyard with a rifle in the barn loft and a lamp in the window, and Warren Pruitt and his brother sitting their horses 20 yards away, watching him with the patient attention of men who would cheerfully use any complications to their own advantage. "Evening then," Rafter said. He went back to his horse. He mounted. He rode back toward Harlan without haste, as though departing after a social call. Warren Pruitt watched him go. Then he looked back at the barn loft. "Mr. Craw," he called, not to the loft but to the farmhouse window. "I wonder if we might talk." They talked. This was not what Tom had expected. He had expected a continuation of the standoff, or an escalation, or a retreat. But Warren Pruitt was not a stupid man, and he understood something that Rafter had either not understood or had chosen not to acknowledge. That the situation had changed. The debt was settled. The farm was legally clean. Whatever had been found on this land was, in the eyes of the law, the property of the man who owned the land. Dunn's leverage was gone. And while Rafter might come back with reinforcements and a different approach, that was a problem for tomorrow, not tonight. Warren Pruitt came to the farmhouse door, alone, with his hat in his hands. Deke waiting with the horses at a distance that said, "I am leaving him a clear avenue of retreat, and you should note that I note this." And he sat at Elias Craw's kitchen table and drank the coffee that Elias set before him and said his piece. He knew what the gold was, or rather, he knew a story about it. A story he'd heard from a Mandan elder in the Dakota Territory 8 years before, an old man named Carries the Morning, who had told him, in the particular way that old men tell things they know you won't understand, but feel compelled to say anyway, about a cache that had been placed in the earth during the Great Dispersal, when the old Confederacy had broken under the pressure of the Lakota expansion, and the Mandan had fled south and west and finally scattered. Not just gold, not just wealth, the ceremonial objects of 3 generations, the physical embodiment of something that no longer existed in the world except in those objects. Warren had spent 8 years following that story through the territories. He was not a sentimental man. He was not, as he freely admitted to Elias, a good man in most of the ways that counted. He was a man who had been looking for something valuable for a long time, and had arrived tonight with the intention of taking it. But he sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at Elias Craw, at the farm deed on the table between them, at the receipt from Dunn's bank, at the 2 rifles leaned against the wall, at Tom standing in the doorway, and he said something that surprised all of them, including, it seemed, himself. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. Elias looked at him across the table. "Pay my debts," Elias said. "Save my farm. You paid 1 piece. What about the rest?" The silence stretched. Outside, a coyote answered another coyote somewhere in the dark. The call and response of predators confirming each other's presence. "I haven't decided," Elias said. Warren turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Carries the Morning told me that when those objects came out of the earth, they would need to be accounted for. Not in our law, in theirs. He said there were people who would know, relatives of those who placed them. He said there was a woman. This was 8 years ago, so I don't know if she's still living. A woman called Stillwater, in the Standing Rock country, who was the last carrier of those particular ceremonies." Nobody spoke. "I'm not telling you what to do," Warren said. "I came here tonight to take it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I've been carrying that old man's words for 8 years, and I reckon they needed to go somewhere." He stood up. He set down the coffee cup. He put his hat back on his head. "Rafter will be back," he said. "Dunn won't let this go. He's a patient man when there's money involved." He looked at Elias. "You want to protect this farm. You need to make whatever you found into something that can't be quietly disappeared. Make it known. Make it official. Make it something that would cost Dunn more to take than to leave alone." "And the rest of it?" Tom said. "The ones we don't sell?" Warren looked at Tom with the direct, appraising gaze of a man who is deciding something about another man's character. "That's between you and your conscience," he said. "And whatever's left of Standing Rock." He walked out. They heard him speak once to Deke, and then the 2 horses moved away east, and the night was quiet again. Elias Craw did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table until the first gray showed in the east, drinking the last of the coffee cold, turning things over in his mind with the methodical patience that was his primary intellectual characteristic. Tom slept for 3 hours in the chair in the corner with his rifle across his lap, the way young men can sleep in the middle of crisis, and woke with the light looking alert and uncreased in the way that seemed to Elias both admirable and faintly unreasonable. "We need a lawyer," Elias said, when Tom was awake enough to be spoken to, and who sat on Elias's porch for the next 4 days with a shotgun and a tobacco pouch, and an expression of deep personal satisfaction at being given an excuse to sit outside and be left alone. Elias carried the receipt and the deed. Tom carried the Winchester. In the wagon bed, under the straw, they carried 2 of the vessels, not as payment, but as evidence, as documentation, as the physical substance of a story that needed to be told to people with the capacity to record it. The lawyer they found in Abilene was a young man named Samuel Bright, 27 years old, recently arrived from Boston with a law degree from Harvard and the particular combination of idealism and practicality that sometimes arrives in the West and usually gets beaten out of men before they're 40. He was tall and thin, with dark eyes, and a way of listening with his whole body that suggested he actually heard what was being said to him, which Elias had found to be genuinely rare in his experience of lawyers, doctors, and clergymen. Samuel Bright sat across from Elias and Tom in his small office on Commerce Street and listened to the entire story without interruption. Then he sat quietly for a moment. "Mr. Craw," he said, "I want to be very clear about what you're telling me. You found a cache of what appears to be pre-contact Sioux or Mandan ceremonial gold on your legally titled property. You've secured your debt with one piece, and you're asking me to help you document and protect the remainder while you pursue contact with the tribe of origin." "That's right. Most men in your position," Samuel said carefully, "would be asking me how to quietly liquidate the remainder." "I reckon they would. May I ask what's motivating the different approach?" Elias considered the question. It was a fair one, and he was a man who believed in fair questions getting honest answers. "I pulled that gold out of ground that it had been in for 1,000 years, he said. "I don't know whose hands put it there. I don't know what they were thinking or what they hoped for. But I know that nothing ends up in the earth for 1,000 years by accident. Things get buried when they need to be kept safe, and they come up when the time is right for them to come up." He paused. "I'm 51 years old, and I've broken my back on that farm for 20 years, and I haven't got enough to show for it to fill a hat. The earth gave me my farm back. I'll take that. But I won't take more than what's mine." Samuel Bright looked at Elias Craw for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll take the case." What followed was not swift, and it was not clean, and it was not without cost. Cornelius Dunn did not, as Warren Pruitt had predicted, simply accept the situation. He moved against the Craw farm through 3 separate legal instruments over the following 6 months. A disputed assessment of the original debt, a challenge to the validity of the receipt on technical grounds, and an attempted seizure of the vessels remaining on the property as collateral for a claimed secondary debt that no paper had ever recorded. Each instrument was met by Samuel Bright with the particular combination of procedural precision and genuine outrage that made him, Elias would later reflect, worth considerably more than he charged. Rafter came back once, in September, alone. He came in daylight, which was different, and he came to the front door, which was different, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands in a posture that was not quite an apology, because Rafter was not built for apologies, but something adjacent to a withdrawal. He said that Dunn had received a letter from the Federal Land Office in Topeka, and that the situation had, in his word, changed. He said that Dunn's appetite for continued engagement with the matter had diminished considerably. He said that he expected Elias would not be hearing from him again. Elias listened to all of this without expression, and then said, "Much obliged," which was the most he was willing to offer. Rafter nodded. He left. Tom watched him ride away from the porch and said nothing until the horse had disappeared around the bend. And then he said, "Reckon that's the last of him?" "Reckon so," Elias said. "Dunn's a careful man when the risk gets too visible. He'll find something else to work on." "What about Pruitt?" Elias looked at his son. "Pruitt rode off," he said. "That's what he did. Might have been the most decent thing he's done in 20 years, and I expect he's already embarrassed by it." Tom almost smiled. "You going to write to Standing Rock?" "Already did," Elias said. The letter took 3 months to find its way through the territorial mail system to the agency at Standing Rock, and another 3 weeks to find its way from the agency to a small winter camp about 40 miles north, where a woman named Margaret Stillwater, 62 years old, Elias's age almost exactly, which he noted when he met her and found curiously significant, was living with her daughter's family through the cold months. The agency man who delivered the letter read it to her because Stillwater did not read English, and she listened to the account of what had been found on a Kansas farm without any visible reaction. And when it was finished, she sat quietly for a long time looking at the fire. And then she said something in Lakota that the agency man translated, somewhat uncertainly as, "He found the singing place." She arrived at the Craw farm in the spring of 1875, accompanied by her daughter's husband, a man named Thomas Waxfar, who spoke some English, and two younger men who rode behind the wagon and watched everything with the careful attention of people who have learned to be careful. Stillwater herself was a compact, still woman with white hair worn in two braids and eyes that were dark and measuring, the eyes of someone who has spent a long time watching people and events and assessing them against some internal standard that she does not explain. She wore a dark blanket coat and practical boots, and she sat on the wagon seat as though she had ridden in wagons her whole life, which she had. Elias met her at the gate of the farm. He was wearing his clean shirt and his good hat, and he had shaved that morning for the first time in a week, which Tom had noted without comment. He stood at the gate as the wagon came to a stop, and he looked at Stillwater, and Stillwater looked at him, and the assessment was mutual and, in its way, complete in about 10 seconds. "Mr. Craw," Thomas Waxfar said. "Welcome," Elias said. He looked at Stillwater. "Welcome to my farm." Thomas Waxfar translated. Stillwater replied. Thomas translated back. "She asks if you know what you found." "No," Elias said. "I know it was old. I know it was important. That's all I know." Stillwater replied. Thomas translated. "She says, you know more than that. She says, a man who knew nothing would have sold it." Elias considered this. "Tell her she's being generous," he said. The answer that came back surprised him. "She says, no. She says, generosity is returning what belongs to someone. She says, you are being honest." He brought them to the barn and showed them where the vessels were, laid out on the clean wood of the workbench in the dim afternoon light. Stillwater stood before them for a long time without touching them, and her face did something during that time that Elias could not name. Not grief exactly, not joy exactly, but something in the territory between them. The emotion of someone who has been carrying a loss for a very long time and has arrived at the place where the loss is. She spoke once, quietly, to no one in particular. Thomas Waxfar did not translate this, and Elias did not ask him to. Then she turned to Elias and asked a question, and Thomas translated it. "She wants to know about the one that's missing. She says there should be 7. I sold one," Elias said, "to pay the bank, to keep this farm." Stillwater listened to this. She was quiet for a moment. "She says," Thomas translated, "that this was right. She says, the earth gives to feed people. This is what these were made for in the beginning. The return of the 6 vessels to the Standing Rock community was not a grand event. There was no ceremony, no newspaper, no crowd. Elias and Tom loaded the vessels back into the wagon, wrapped in the same burlap and straw they'd been carried in, and drove them north through 3 days of spring travel, following Stillwater's wagon, sleeping under the sky and eating cold food and speaking very little. Samuel Bright had come with them, because Samuel Bright had, somewhere in the process of handling Elias Craw's legal affairs, developed a personal investment in the outcome that exceeded any professional obligation, and because he wanted to witness something he suspected he would spend the rest of his life thinking about. On the evening of the 3rd day, they arrived at the winter camp, and Stillwater's daughter came out to meet the wagon, and then others, and the vessels were carried inside, and a fire was built, and Elias and Tom and Samuel Bright sat outside at a respectful distance and ate the food that was brought to them and listened to the sounds from inside. Voices, the particular rhythm of speech that was not conversation but something more formal, and the night came down over the plains, and the stars appeared one by one and then all at once in their millions. The same stars that had been over this country when the gold was placed in the ground and when it was lifted out again. Tom sat with his rifle across his knees, as he always did in unfamiliar territory, but his posture was easy, his eyes were not scanning, and he looked younger than usual in the firelight. Younger than 22 even, the way people sometimes look when they are at peace with something. Samuel Bright was writing in his notebook with the focus of a man recording something he does not want to trust to memory. Elias sat with his hands on his knees and his good hat on his head, and he looked at the fire and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for him and which felt, in its unusual way, entirely correct. Thomas Walks-Far came out of the lodge and sat down near them and poured himself coffee from the pot and sat for a while in the comfortable silence of men who have been through something together. Then he said, in his careful English, "She wants you to know something." "All right," Elias said. "She says the singing place sang because it was ready. She says it chose its time and it chose the man who found it. This is not something she can explain to you fully because it is a thing understood in one way and not another. But she wants you to know you were not an accident." Elias sat with this for a moment. "Tell her," he said, "that I'm glad the timing worked out." Thomas Walks-Far smiled at this and translated, and from inside the lodge there was what sounded, in the firelight and the quiet of the plains, very much like a laugh. They drove home. It took 3 days again, and the spring was further along on the return, the grasses greener, the sky a different quality of blue than it had been going north, fuller somehow, more inhabited. Tom drove most of the way, giving his father the chance to sit beside him and do nothing, which Elias accepted with something that was either grace or exhaustion and probably contained elements of both. On the last night, camped beside a creek that had more water in it than Elias had seen in 4 years of Kansas drought, Tom built the fire and made the coffee, and they ate and were quiet, and the creek made its sound in the dark, and the trees moved in the light wind, and eventually Tom said, "What now?" Elias thought about it. The farm was clear. The deed was in his name with no liens against it. He had Samuel Bright keeping watch on Dunn's future activities, which the experience seemed to have made Dunn considerably more cautious about. He had the summer ahead, and seed money, and a farm that the drought seemed, this spring, to be easing its grip on. He had his son beside him. "Plant the south field," he said. "The whole section this time. Corn and sorghum both." Tom nodded. "That's the field where—" "I know what field it is." They were quiet for a moment. "You think there's more down there?" Tom asked. Elias considered this. He thought about the sound the plow had made against the vessel, that deep, resonant tone, like a bell in a church he'd never been inside. He thought about Stillwater's phrase, the singing place. He thought about what the earth kept and what it gave back, and the 1,000 years that separated a people's placing from a bankrupt farmer's finding. "I think," he said, "that if there's more down there, it'll come up when it's ready and not a minute before." He picked up his coffee cup. "And I think we'd both better be ready for it when it does." Tom looked at his father across the fire. The pale eyes steady, the gray-haired head slightly bent under the battered straw hat. The hands wrapped around the coffee cup, big and dark and work-worn. The hands of a man who had taken what the earth gave and tried, as best he could, to give back what was owed. "Yes, sir," Tom said. The fire burned down. The creek ran on. The stars completed their long turn overhead, the same stars as always, indifferent and vast, and in their vastness somehow comforting. The sky that had been over this country when the first hands shaped gold into ceremony, when the first prayers went up from this particular piece of earth, when the first seed went into the first furrow, and when a plow struck something that was not stone and rang, and a ruined man dropped to his knees in the dirt and found, buried under his failing farm, not just gold, but the means of becoming someone he hadn't known, until that moment, that he still had the capacity to be. The farm waited for them to come home. The south field waited for the plow. The earth kept its own counsel, as it always had, and always would, long after every man who had ever broken it or blessed it or buried treasure in it was himself returned to the same dark and patient ground. Before we close out this story, if this kind of Western narrative moves you the way it moves us, We'd love to have you along for every new one. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss when a new story drops. Now the final chapter of Elias Craw and the gold that changed everything. The summer of 1875 was the best growing season the Craw farm had seen in a decade. The rains came at the right times. The corn came up straight and thick. The sorghum did well in the drier stretches to the south. Judith the mare, who had been showing her age for 2 years, seemed to get her second wind in the spring and moved with something approaching her old efficiency, as though the change in the farm's circumstances had communicated itself even to the horse. Walt Hedges, who had spent 4 days on Elias's porch with his shotgun and his tobacco in the autumn and never mentioned wanting payment, came over one evening in July to look at the corn and stood at the edge of the field for a long time and then said, "That's a crop," which from Walt Hedges was the equivalent of a lengthy and enthusiastic celebration. Samuel Bright wrote from Abilene twice that summer. The first letter was professional. Dunn had been involved in an unrelated dispute with a federal land assessor, which had consumed his attention and his legal resources, and had diminished his appetite for further engagements with anything that might attract federal scrutiny. The second letter was personal. Samuel had been corresponding with Thomas Waxfar, who had relayed some of what Stillwater had communicated after the vessels were returned. And Samuel was writing to share one thing that he thought Elias should know. The vessels, Stillwater had said, had been placed in the earth during a time of great difficulty, not as a burial, but as a loan. Given to the earth to keep safe through a time when keeping them safe was beyond any person's capacity. Given with the understanding that the earth would return them when the time was right and the need was real. This was not a Lakota belief exactly, Stillwater had said. It was older than that, older than any nation's name for it. It was simply how things worked. Elias read this letter sitting at his kitchen table in the morning, with the window open and the summer sound of the farm coming in. Birdsong, the distant lowing of Hedges' cattle, the knock of Tom's hammer somewhere near the barn where he was fixing the east fence. And he sat with it for a long time without putting it down. He was not a man who believed in things he couldn't see. He was not a man who found comfort in the invisible. He had built his life and then rebuilt it again from the visible and tangible. Soil, seed, water, timber, the physical facts of weather and season, and the mechanical truth of a plow turning earth. These were what he trusted. These were what he knew. But he was 51 years old, and he had knelt in a furrow and wept, and he had driven north with a wagon of gold that wasn't his, and driven home with the kind of quiet that settles in a man when he has done a thing that cannot be measured, but that he knows, in whatever instrument he uses for such knowing, was right. He folded Samuel's letter and put it in the same coat pocket where he kept the deed to his farm. Then he went outside and found Tom at the east fence and picked up the extra hammer that was lying on the fence post and started knocking nails, and they worked together in the summer morning without speaking, because they were the kind of men who needed to say very little to understand a great deal. And the fence needed mending, and the farm was theirs, and the day was clear and hot and smelled of grass and dry timber and the honest, permanent earth beneath their boots. The gold was gone. The debt was gone. The men who had come in the dark were gone. What remained was what had always been there, waiting under the trouble and the drought and the years of diminishment for exactly this moment. Not treasure, not ceremony, not anything that could be weighed or sold or stolen in the night. Just a farm. Just a father and his son. Just the south field with its corn standing tall and the Craw name on the deed and the particular quality of light on a Kansas morning in July that made the world look, if you caught it at the right angle, like something that had been arranged specifically for the comfort of the people who lived in it, which, in ways that Elias Craw was just beginning to consider might be true, perhaps it had.